Hi, my name's Lee Jasper. This is Brixton, South London, and you're watching Lee Jasper Drive Time.
Our people in the spotlight because the time's right. Black lives matter, pump your fist for the good fight. Good people take a stand, building bridges in this land. We chop it up and compensate reasons. This is drive time. We chop it up and compensate reasons. Drive time.
Hi, welcome to Lee Jasper Drive Time for another show where we delve deep into the key issues that are affecting black communities throughout the United Kingdom and the world. Today, of course, we're waiting for the COVID-19 vote in the Houses of Parliament. Winter has most certainly arrived, and of course, we're about to fall off the Brexit white cliffs of Dover into God knows what hellish scenario this country has dragged us into. But today, at least, you're with me, Lee Jasper, bringing you a bit of brightness and cheer. And this morning, we're going to talk about a very serious topic. And many of you will know that my career as an activist was based on challenging police abuses of power over the last 30 or 40 years. And one of the most earliest cases that I came into contact with was that of Richard and Audrey Adams, whose son Roland Adams was brutally murdered by a group of 15 to 20 neo-Nazis in 1981. Roland, who was with his young brother Nathan, was only 15 at the time, found himself in the southeast London being the victim of a broad rash of racist murders that were happening at the time. Many people know the name of Stephen Lawrence. Not enough people know the name of Roland Adams, and I take every opportunity and no apology for making sure that his name is remembered. And why I'm speaking about that is because, of course, his family, along with the Lawrences and many more environmental campaigners, trade unionists, political campaigns, stretching back for the last 40 years, have been subject to covert spying by the police. That's undercover police officers who secrete themselves with false identities, actually using the names of dead, deceased children, which is, I mean, it's just despicable even to be able to do such a thing. But anyway, that's what they did, and they got alongside all of these campaigners, trade unionists, environmental campaigners. Some of these undercover officers even had relationships with individuals and fathered children in their undercover persona. It is a sordid and squalid affair, and there's been an undercover policing inquiry that was announced by Theresa May in 2015. Now, I always noticed, and I wrote an article about it at the time, Theresa May used political inquiries, public inquiries as a form of Aikido, using the strength of your opponent against you. She always concedes to demands for public inquiries, particularly on the most difficult issues, because then she can tie it up in constitutional rules and processes, laws, and find a convenient judge, a chair. We've seen it in the sex abuse inquiry, child sex abuse inquiry. We've seen it in the Grenfell inquiry, and now we're seeing it in the undercover policing inquiry. 5 years on, £30 million later, 200 co-participants, a whole galaxy of lawyers representing those who've been affected and spied upon. And this morning, we're going to focus on what that inquiry is about. It was only started in November of this year, some 5 years after it was announced. And it's been adjourned now for over the Christmas period. And this morning, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Richard and Audrey Adams, the parents of Roland Adams, and Jane Deighton, solicitor for Dwayne Brooks. Remember Dwayne Brooks, who was with Stephen Lawrence at the point he died and was treated appallingly by the Metropolitan Police Service, and I have to say by members of our own community. And of course, she represents my old mate, Ken Livingston, who, as chair of the Anti-Racist Alliance and so on, was the subject of spying. You may ask, weren't you the subject of spying, Lee? And I would say, of course we were. But I didn't think I was going to waste 5 years, 6 years of my life preparing for an inquiry that was going to be a sham. And I'm unfortunately been proven right. And today we are joined by Richard, Audrey and Jane. Guys, thank you so much for coming on today. So here we are at the point where you've entered an inquiry you're hoping for the bright light of transparency, truth and justice to be shone on who spied on you, what they were up to, and how they got on. How's it been going so far?
Well, I think we should remind everyone about what happened that fateful night when Roland was murdered.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to.
Yeah, well, our two sons, Roland and Nathan, 15 and 14 years old, simply went to play table tennis over at Thamesmead. And, you know, they on the way back, standing at a bus stop, they were set upon by a gang of about 15 to 20, as you stated, white racist. And Roland was stabbed almost immediately, and he shouted to his brother, "Run!" And that's how they got separated, and they ran. And Nathan returned towards where he felt that he could meet up with Roland, and he found him dying. And you know, and the rest is history to a degree. You know, the police tried to frame it, you know, as a territorial fight and all the rest of it. It was, you know, none of the perpetrators knew of my children. You know, it was an unprovoked attack. They didn't know anything about what was going on, broadly speaking, over there at the time. And you mentioned that that Dwayne Brooks was treated appallingly by the police. My son equally, Nathan, my surviving son, he was treated exactly in the same fashion as Dwayne Brooks. And the CPS and the police connived to have this, not as a racist murder, but more of a territorial dispute and all the rest of it. And the defending barristers didn't have to do anything. The work of the defendants, lawyers, they didn't have to do anything because the police and the CPS painted a sufficient picture of what their clients did or did not do, or how they acted. So you know, I mean, in murder cases that people don't know, you know, you can't choose your barristers and solicitors and all the rest of it. It's done by the state. And if the state is against you, you're in big trouble. And it was up to the judge to basically, you know, impartially look through the literature and what was said at the time of the murder and the witness statements and all the rest of it. And he concluded that it was a racist murder, you know, something that, you know, the brains and the intelligence of the police and the CPS, they were unable to see in all the evidence they had at their disposal, which was exactly the same as the judges, but they came to two different, you know,
Conclusions. We all remember, well, I should say I remember, obviously vividly remember, the incidents and the case of Roland, which you describe there. And of course, out of the whole group of neo-Nazis that were in the dock, only one eventually got charged with murder. And so there are at least, 14, 15 people walking around today, free at liberty, enjoying their families, who were responsible and informed in that murder and have not yet been convicted. And I think that to me has been the most powerful stain. That and the way that Nathan was treated, the way that Dwayne were treated, the way that all the victims back then were treated by the Metropolitan Police was if you were the problem, you were the criminals, you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Whatever excuse they could come up with, they came up with. So it's you know, it's a timely reminder to go back and to revisit those issues. And I know that you've been working hard to memorialise Roland's memory in charitable works and trusts and great work with young families in Jamaica, and many more of those issues. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we decided in, what was it? We've always, as you know, since Roland died, we campaigned quite vigorously to get justice for him. We knew. I just want to go back to that time, Lee. If you don't, if you.
No,
bear
go
with
ahead.
me.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to let the viewers know that after Roland was murdered, we expected justice for him and Nathan. What happened was we then became police suspects. The people that did the murder and were terrorizing us at the time walked around freely doing what they wanted to do. What really sticks in my claw really is the fact that you lose your child, another one was brutally attacked, and then the police then turn around and decide to put us under surveillance. And I don't know why this was done. When our family, you know what it's like in the black community, if somebody dies, let alone murders, everybody comes together to support the family and get them through that traumatic period. When our families were leaving from all over London and all over the country to come to support us in our home, the police would stop them at least a mile away from our house, near the roundabout where Roland died, to be honest, and turn them away. They had them under surveillance. They had us under surveillance. We couldn't leave our home without the police being around. We knew if you looked outside our house at given times, you'd see cars outside, people banging on doors, banging on flashing lights, literally terrorizing us. We'd tell the police, they did nothing. I remember it quite clearly that they did nothing to protect us. And then we ended up being, when we started the family campaign to get justice, which we're entitled to, nothing happened apart from let's put them under surveillance. What we going along with this, talking about this inquiry, what really gets me as well is that, remember, we are taxpayers. Me and my husband have worked. My husband's family, my family, both our parents came to this country, built this country after the Second World War, worked very hard, experienced terrible racism. We as first generation worked hard, had our children, brought our children up and paid our taxes to be treated the way that we have been treated then and now. But we'll get onto that now later.
Well, I mean, the fact that no justice there was a saying, wasn't there, back then that I remember. There is no justice, there is just us. And that's the way that as a black community we felt over the last 40 years. How did it feel eventually because I think we always suspected, didn't we, that we were being spied upon. How did it feel when Peter Francis, the undercover police officer, decided to disclose to The Guardian some years ago now that, in fact, I was that guy. I was the one who was spying on a family. How did you receive the news?
Well, we always suspected that, for obvious reasons, obvious reasons, it's obvious to us. I mean, my wife and I, virtually every day, we would, we'd receive telephone calls and you could hear clicking on the lines. You could hear also, we would have phone calls, not every breathing ones, there's just nothing there. And it was also, our family homes were broken into suspiciously, many of them. And you're talking about nothing other than perhaps, sort of like birth certificate and them sort of things would disappear and all sorts. But there was no reason we've never had a break into our houses before. But then
and it was several members of our family. Yeah. When we started to, really become active, several members of our family's houses were broken into. We decided at one stage that we wouldn't even have a phone in our home. Can you imagine that? Because you knew that you were being listened to. And when we raised it time after time after time. They said that we were
Yeah.
paranoid. It's ridiculous. No one took it seriously. Well, when I say no one, the authorities didn't take it seriously, but we knew.
Yeah, so I felt vindicated.
Yeah.
You know, because we've been saying it all along, and we've been even telling the authorities that, what's happening here, and but now I feel vindicated.
We weren't surprised.
Yeah.
It
We're
was like,
surprised,
okay.
absolutely.
But yeah, we weren't surprised.
And how have you experienced the inquiry itself then? This Sir John Mitting, Garrick Club, 72-year-old white guy. Well, he'd have to be white guy, wouldn't he? Most of the juries are white. How have you experienced it so far?
Well, the thing about it is, right, I just thought that, incremental, it's a hope that, incrementally, things are getting better. And, but quite clearly after the housing crash and now COVID, you can see, how racism is revealing itself again. And this guy is just, it's just a throwback to what was awful about our experiences in England. It's a public inquiry, but you can't have public there. We can't have live streaming in our homes. It's not. It's a public inquiry about us being wronged, but they're not listening to us. They're basically telling us what we can have. They're telling us how it will be done. I understand that the judge has never been on a equal opportunities training. He doesn't know anything about, the plights of black people in this country.
Well, of course.
It just beggars belief that you can choose. I won't call him a racist because I don't know the man, but it's quite clear his general behavior points in that direction.
You know what? Let me bring in Jane Deighton here, your solicitor, because Jane has had to had close-up forensic examination of this Sir John Mitting in action. Jane, welcome to the Lee Jasper Drive Time. Thanks for being patient with us. Give us your view on this inquiry, 5 years in the making, and already within weeks of hearing evidence, there are howls of discontent and objection to some of the rulings of this John Mitting.
Well, Richard hit the nail on the head when he said it was a public inquiry that is not public. And that's the core of this, and that's the core of the problem. Not only is it not public insofar as at the only hearing where evidence was taken, the public were banned. Participants, people who've been spied upon, like Richard and Audrey, if they wanted to hear the evidence, they were required to travel to a central London hotel right in the middle of the COVID pandemic.
Can I just stop you there, Jane? Can I just stop? So are you saying, just so that the public are absolutely clear, so the victims could not, in the COVID pandemic era, could not have the hearing live streamed to their homes? They had to attend in central London, and the public are not allowed in the public inquiry.
That's absolutely right. And let's just unpick that a bit. One person had live streaming, and that was the chairman, Mitting. Mitting decided that he would have live streaming to his home in the countryside, from which he would run the inquiry. Now, it seems to us that he recognised that there was an inherent danger for people to travel to central London in the middle of a COVID pandemic. And he was not going to put himself into that danger. He hasn't given a reason, but that seems to be logical if he allows himself to have live streaming. But other call participants, the vast majority, were refused. And they were refused despite the fact the case was made to Mitting that for very many people who've been spied on, people such as Richard and Audrey, the risks to them, because they're black, because of disabilities, because of age, is significantly higher than, say, the risk to me travelling to central London. So it was quite clearly discriminatory, these arrangements, quite clearly, in my view, without a doubt. And this was put to him and argued to him, and he simply dismissed it out of hand, said he wouldn't look at it. So not only do we have the public excluded, we have effectively the people who are spied on excluded, and we have the people who are spied on being subjected now, today, during the inquiry, which is meant to, according to Theresa May, bring them some sort of justice, themselves being once again discriminated against. It's simply unacceptable. But that's one bit. That's about the participation at the first hearing. But the secrecy really goes far deeper than that. The delays that you mentioned, Lee, of 5 years, is worth looking at what actually was going on in those delays. What was going on was that the police were making applications to try and secure their continued privacy, to try and keep themselves hidden from the public in a public inquiry into them. And so, backed with public money, police officer after police officer applied to the inquiry, either that both their cover name and their real names were restricted, i.e. that we wouldn't know about them, that Richard and Audrey wouldn't know about them, the public wouldn't know about them, or their real names were. Now, let's just think about this. And a third of those applications were not successful. So currently, only about a third of the police officers known to have spied on people in the last, since 1968, have their cover names released. That's 1/3. So what does that mean about the 2/3?
Jane was explaining to us why there's been so many delays over the last 5 years, and the fact that the police officers have used public money to apply for anonymity, and that's the least of the problems that they face. Jane, you were saying?
So if we just unpick that, if more or less 2/3 of the officers remain anonymous, how are people that they spied upon going to be able to find out that they were spied upon by those officers? How is the inquiry going to have any evidence about the activities and the impact of those officers other than from the officers themselves? So the effect of the inquiry's decision to anonymise these officers is basically to say, okay, we're going to run this inquiry only on the basis of information given to us by the people we are inquiring into. It is really quite extraordinary, but sadly it doesn't stop there, because obviously undercover officers create documents, they write intelligence reports, and those intelligence reports, we're learning, go from the undercover officers to special branch to MI5. Now, the first problem here is that the terms of the inquiry exclude MI5. We've argued, and to some extent we've been successful, to say that where it can be shown that MI5 are directing the activities of these officers, those directions should be considered by the inquiry. But we've got somewhere on that in principle, but nowhere in practice. And the notion that the people who are really behind this, which is MI5 and the politicians behind them, are going to be before this inquiry, I think is a fantasy that we'll be fighting to make a reality, but I don't feel hugely optimistic about that. But let's just think about these documents. We know that most people who are participants in the inquiry, there are special branch files about them. There's a whole file about what the officers say they found out about them. Some of it will be true, some of it will be nonsense. So you think the most basic thing any inquiry could do was to say to the participants, here's your file. This is what is being said about you. What do you say about the contents of this file? Not only have the inquiry refused to provide those files, They've actually said it's something of a distraction to provide those files to the people who are being spied upon. I think it's wrong. I think it is a breach of the Data Protection Act. If they're holding information about people and people ask about information, the holder of that information is required to hand it over. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. But then they are getting the inquiry getting some information from the police. They say they've got over 1 million documents. We've seen, and not everybody, but the people who were spied upon in the early days, in the late 60s, have seen about 5,000.
Wow.
And they were gradually published on the website. And what we found out about those documents is the other reason for the delay, is that they've been largely blanked out. They call it redactions, and there are redactions throughout them. So you get to an interesting bit and there's a great blank. So that's another element of the secrecy. And we can go on and on. They're not publishing photographs of officers at the time. And again, you know, if an officer's spying on you in the 1970s or 80s, are you going to remember a name if the inquirer's been generous enough to let you know the name, or are you likely to recognise a photograph? Well, a photograph would be really helpful, but no, those photographs are not, on the whole, being released. Would groups, activist groups, like to know whether they were spied upon? Well, we've been told probably about 1,000, if my memory is right, about 1,000 groups have been spied upon. We don't know the names of most of those groups. We haven't been told. So you asked a comment about the inquiry. It's not a public inquiry.
That's right.
And to my mind, it's barely an inquiry at all.
It's an abusive process, if ever I've heard that term used. It's usefully applied here. We're going to return to this in the new year. And Lee Jasper Drive Time is going to invite Jane and Audrey back to catalogue how they're experiencing this journey going forward. It's not a very auspicious start, it has to be said. But for now, I'd just like to thank my guests who've been incredibly patient.
Lee, before you go, we'd just like to put on the record that we never had any confidence in the process. We have no confidence in this inquiry. We want to see what records they have on us. We think that's our basic entitlement. I want to put on record as well, we are taxpayers. We need to see how our money is being spent. And this inquiry is not spending taxpayers' money correctly. We need to know what is going on, not just us, all of the core participants want to know what the police have on us, why they decided to spy on us, how long, when it started, why it started, has it stopped? Because we believe they're still spying on us. Those are the basic things that we want to know before we move forward with anything else.
Well, I think that's the minimum.
As Deighton has said, it is an entitlement whereby from the Information Commission, we're entitled to this information. In any other sphere of life, if we ask for the information that you have on us, we would be entitled to have it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. We'll be, as I say, raising these issues throughout the new year to make sure that we bring a bright light on what is an appalling process, an abusive process, and a denial of justice. The undercover policing inquiry is aptly named because it is an inquiry that is itself undercover. Well, thanks very much for you guys for joining me and being so patient. Jane Deighton, solicitor supreme and legend in the legal world, and Richard and Audrey Adams, very good friends of mine. We'll be back to revisit these issues going forward in the future. But now we're going to take a short break. We'll be back with you soon.